I'd like to call to order the Teachers Retirement Board, December 2nd, 2013. Jennifer, if you could call roll, please, that would be terrific.
For the State Treasurer, Mr. Boykin. For the Director of Finance, Ms. Ortega. Mr. Lawson.
Here.
Ms. Hendricks.
Here.
For the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Mr. Zager. Mr. Unterman. For the State Controller, Mr. McGuire.
Here.
Mr. Keeley.
Here.
Chairperson Dillon, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Alrighty. First item on our agenda is approval of the board agenda and work plan. Entertain a motion to approve.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? Any abstentions? I don't know why I was all surprised when y'all voted aye, but for some reason I was.
I just want to mention again, in case people, for the audience, in April, we added to your work plan just a presentation on the California teacher study that we talked about, since a lot of people aren't familiar with this great work we've done on studying breast cancer in teachers. So the people from USC will be up here to do a presentation.
Oh, that's great. Do you know who's coming yet?
I'm assuming Rich, I'm not sure who else he's bringing along with him.
Alrighty, it'll be good to see Rich again. Ready? Anything else, Jack? All right, Ed, we'll turn this over to you for the credible comp regulation,
Okay,
first reading.
Thank you, Dana. Let me just start out by saying that, this is still where we are in the process. We've been working really closely with the stakeholder groups, the employee unions, the school administrators, a large number of people, just get a better understanding of the implications of what we're looking at to the actual day-to-day operations of the schools. I think one of the things we want to make sure everyone understands is that everybody feels it's really important that we do these regulations to provide some clarity around what is and isn't creditable and how it's treated for DB versus DBS. And while we haven't necessarily resolved every issue, I think we're far enough along where we believe it's a good idea to actually start the formal rulemaking process, which is what we're recommending the board direct us to do as a result of today's meeting. And actually start the process where we can get some formal comments, and we can continue to work with the stakeholder groups to refine that language to get it to the best possible situation. In terms of what I want to do today is sort of remind everybody about why credible compensation is important. We sort of talked a little bit about it at the September meeting, but just to refresh your memory and then sort of walk through the regulations as they currently exist, talk a little bit about what we see going forward as far as the process and what we do in the meantime. And then obviously, if anybody has any questions about any specific provisions of the regulations, be happy to answer that. Also, the other thing is, before we get started, I want to sort of point out that this has been the effort. This is like a quite of a complicated situation that involves a lot of different parts of the organization, audits, compensation review unit, other parts of member account services. And I want to, although a lot of people have been involved in it, I want to sort of single out a couple of people who have been sort of dealing with this thing on a daily basis and probably would love to have this thing be done, but it's not quite there. One is Ellen Maurizio in our research and development unit, who's sort of now been designated as somewhat of the czarina of regulations for CalSTRS. So as we do more regulations, she's the one who sort of coordinates all that effort to make sure that it's done appropriate to the Administrative Procedure Act. And then also Cassandra Mallet-Beck, who's actually back here in the audience, who's like the business expert from Member Account Services, who works very closely with Ellen on trying to get these regulations to work, not only for CalSTRS, but also for the schools. So in terms of just to sort of remind people why credible compensation is important is the defined benefit service retirement formula, as everybody knows, is a function of the age that people retire at, how much service credit they earn, and what their final compensation is. Both their service credit and their final compensation are affected by their credible compensation. And by credible compensation, we mean the compensation that's paid for somebody who performs credible service. And credible service is defined in the law as a variety of different activities, such as teaching, counseling, nurses, superintendents, a whole host of things that require a credential or operate under standards adopted by the Board of Governors of the community colleges. And whatever compensation they earn, if it meets the definition of what's creditable, then is used to determine their service credit and their final compensation. A lot of the compensation, not a lot, but some of the compensation that people earn is credible to CalSTRS, but isn't credited to the defined benefit program, and therefore it doesn't affect their final compensation. That compensation goes into their DBS account. The contributions that they pay and that their employer pays goes into that account. It's credited with interest that the board establishes each year, and then when they retire, they get that benefit either as a lump sum or as a lifetime annuity if they so choose. So it's really important that we have some clarity around what is and is not credible compensation, and that's what the thrust of these regulations are about. In the past, there was a significant change in defining what was credible compensation that was enacted in 2000 and took effect in 2002. At the time, we had developed a credible compensation guide to provide some guidance, had done some directives, but we felt that those really weren't done in accordance with what Administrative Procedures Act would provide for the promulgation of regulations. So they were sort of no longer supported in terms of didn't keep it updated, took it off the website, all those things. But there's been a lack of guidance other than that provided the employers, and that's what the employers have been seeking, is some very specific guidance about what is and isn't credible to CalSTRS. So that's what these are about. So in terms of what is credible to DB, I'll go into these in more detail, but basically it's salary and remuneration in addition to salary. And salary is fairly straightforward, although we do sort of define it in these draft regulations about what are the qualities of salary. And the remuneration in addition to salary is compensation that would be creditable, but it doesn't actually meet doesn't have the same qualities that salary has. And to the extent that the compensation is earned in a manner for their primary contract up to a year of service, that goes to DB. If it's salary or remuneration in addition to salary that's paid for service that's beyond their full year of service, that goes to their DBS. So that's where you see that the service credit in excess of a year, that compensation is credited to DBS. And also limited term payments that are paid for a defined period of time. For example, somebody might be paid $10,000 if they agree to retire at the end of the school year, or to work one more year, or something along those lines, or they worked for the district for 20 years and they said, we're going to give you a $5,000 one-time payment. Those kinds of things do not count towards final compensation because they'd have the effect of spiking the pension, and therefore under the law, those get credited to DBS as well. And then compensation that CalSTRS determined is being paid to enhance the member's benefits because it's not consistently treated throughout the career or for a variety of other things, other reasons, those are also credited to DBS. Now, the other thing I want to make clear is all the conversation that we're having right now and the regulations themselves only apply to members who were hired before this year, the 2% of 60 members. 2% of 62 members have somewhat different compensation that's credible. Specifically, limited term payments and payments that are made to enhance benefits are specifically not creditable at all to CalSTRS. So there's no contributions paid on those kinds of things, doesn't go to DB or DBS, it's simply just not compensation that is affected by their retirement benefit. So the terms of those regulations only apply to 2% of 60 members to the extent in legislations enacted this past year where we did more to define the 2% of 62 credible compensation. We feel that for the time being, it's sufficient to deal with it. If we need to do regulations to further clarify that, we can certainly do that. So in terms of things that aren't creditable at all, if someone gets paid something that isn't paid to the entire class of employees, meaning people who have similar jobs or similar duties or work in a similar program, then it's not creditable. So if, for example, a teacher gets paid $1,000 for, and it's not anything that other teachers are in the same class are eligible to or could receive if they met the eligibility, then it's not creditable to CalSTRS at all. There's no contributions paid. By the same token, fringe benefits, job-related expenses, those kinds of things that are not compensation but are not salary remuneration in addition to salary also is not credible to CalSTRS. And then finally, annuities and insurance payments that are paid by the employer. So if, for example, an employer makes a contribution to a 403B plan or a life insurance policy, the value of those premiums that are paid by the employer is also not creditable to CalSTRS, and it doesn't affect their retirement benefits at all. Any questions so far before I get going in terms of what we're doing here? So in terms of the sort of section-by-section review of all this, again, as I said, this only applies to people who are members who were hired before 2013, so that the 2% is 60 members. And as I said, if we need some regulations with respect to the members that are in the 2% of 62 formula, we can do that at a future date, but we feel that we have sufficient guidance statutorily that we can proceed with that. Also, the expectation at this point, the way it's drafted, is that these would become effective on July 1, 2014. Depending upon how the rulemaking process proceeds, it may be delayed to some degree. We feel it's definitely workable that it take effect at any point in the course of the school year. July 1 is usually the time that we try to target it, and as I said, if this all goes very smoothly and we only need one comment period, then we think we can meet that deadline. Otherwise, it may be later in the school year. In terms of the section that defines a class of employees, as I said, the class of employees is important because in order for something to be creditable, the compensation that's paid has to be consistent within that class of employees. So, for example, teachers would be a class of employees, principals might be a class of employees, guidance counselors could be a class of employees, but they have to perform they have to have the same job duties that are specified in the statute as what's credible activities, or they could be both teaching and a different job duty, and as long as they both have those similar kinds of job duties, they can be in the same class of employees. If there is inconsistency amongst the class, as I said, the compensation won't be creditable. Now, under the law, you can have a class of one. For example, the superintendent would be presumably the only person who's the superintendent in the district, and so in theory, you could have a class of one, and then there's some rules around how we define what's creditable and what's not, because their compensation may be different than or the compensation growth may be different, so we want to make sure that we have good measurements of consistency to make sure that there isn't spiking going on. But that's important that the job duties be consistent for everybody in the class of employees. Or alternatively, they could be in the same program, so they could be a special ed teacher would be a separate program. Something that's established pursuant to state or federal law could be in the same class of employees. Even if they are teachers like other teachers, they could be in a different class than other teachers who are, for example, special ed teachers. In terms of the kinds of things that you cannot establish as a criteria, it's really around things that could be used to manipulate compensation towards the end of someone's career to promote an enhancement of benefits. And so, for example, you might provide, somebody might say that, well, everybody who's 60 years old and older or has 20, 30 years of service as a separate class of employees. Under the regulations and consistent with the statute, that's not a reasonable criteria, because the problem with that is that what might happen is that they could be paid at a higher level at the end of their career, therefore they'd end up spiking their pension, and it wouldn't be consistent with the underlying principle of the DB program. So things, for example, as I said, a maximum or minimum threshold for age or service credit, an option that people work longer days, work more classes, work more days, who perform similar job duties. Those, if they're otherwise doing the same job duties as other people, that would not be sufficient to constitute a separate class of employees. That additional work that they do, either in a longer day or in more days, would be service in excess of their 1 year service credit, and that compensation would be credited to their DBS account. So the underlying theory behind all of this, and the underlying theory that has always existed in the DB program, is that what counts towards final compensation is supposed to be reasonably consistent to a pattern of their career or in the position that they're in, or comparable to other people in the class employees. And if it is, then that compensation can count towards their final compensation. If it's not consistent, if it's creditable at all, it'll be credited to their DBS account.
Now, Ed. Sure.
Yeah, Ed, I just wanted to ask about, because I'm just thinking about different scenarios like coaching or things like that. I mean, or people get paid to be mentors in the community college districts and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So we have people who are coaches for like 10 years or 15 years and get, a compensation or stipend in addition to their regular salary. So you're saying that additional stipend, coaching stipend is not, is a different, are they still in the same class of employee with other
Well, they might
faculty or
be,
teachers?
they could handle in a couple of ways. One is that they could have a class of employees of people who teach and are coaches or teach and do other extracurricular activities. That could be separate from people who do teaching alone. And so they could create as a separate class of employees because they have different job duties. Or alternatively, they could report the compensation of teaching and report that separately from the compensation they earn as a separate assignment from coaching. What we found is that that's probably more problematic for the schools because you have to sort of define what the full-time salary rate is for that, and a lot of times they just sort of paid $5,000 a coach, and they can't really do that. So when we initially were looking at this, we wanted them to have them as separate assignments. What we found is that it probably didn't work, so we're basically, under the draft regulations, we're basically giving the district a choice. Either they can do it that way, it's a separate assignment if they want to, or they can create it as a class of employees who have sort of a mixture of job duties, such as what you said.
I guess my concern is that districts, it just seems like, we have a lot of school districts in California, and it seems like we're trying to work on having more consistency with districts and what they report to CalSTRS.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm concerned of giving districts options because it just seems like knowing the district I work for example, might choose a certain way and then, Los Rios a different way. And I just wonder if that might promote some inconsistencies and some issues.
Well, as long as, but they have to maintain consistency internally. If they start restructuring compensation, then we would presumably flag that, and it may have, and they may end up not having things count towards their final compensation. Otherwise, would count. I mean, what we're not necessarily looking for. I mean, obviously, we want to have as much consistency as possible across the state, but particularly what we're concerned about is consistency within the employer. So as long as they consistently apply it in a certain way, that probably would be okay. The end result of either way, it shouldn't end up with any material difference in the outcome. It's just a question of how they report it. And we just wanted to be sensitive to that.
So just kind of in following up then, so this faculty member or teacher who's a coach, if they're part of this separate class of employee, then their coaching stipend would be part of their credible compensation?
It would be part of their compensation, what's called the compensation earnable, which affects their final compensation, their service credit. If as an alternative, they had, let's say they were a full-time teacher and then coached, and they did as a separate assignment, that coaching, assuming it's paid at a lower rate, that would go into their DBS account.
I understand the principle, and I think it's right. I assume that these determinations are made at the front end when compensation decisions are made, and that the rule that goes with that is that if it doesn't count, you don't have to pay in.
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of how we determine that, I mean, sometimes we may not see it until something gets flagged and either in an audit or the compensation review
The point of
unit.
doing the regulations.
So that's why we want the regulations to make it absolutely clear that this is what you should be doing,
Right.
and so do it this way. Right.
Okay, but if it's compensation that will not count,
Then you do not pay
then
contributions
you
on
don't pay
it.
contribution.
Right.
Neither piece pays contribution.
Neither piece. Nobody pays any contributions on it.
All right.
Okay? So in terms of going through the draft regulations, so the first piece is defining what's salary, identifying what's salary. And again, this is primarily what the biggest part of what's credible. So it's compensation that's paid in cash by an employer to an employee for performing credible service. And the reason why it's clear that it's paid in cash is as opposed to getting something like, for example, a car. If you get a car, then that is not salary because it's not payable in cash. So this is a distinction between it's not necessarily things that are just taxable, because if somebody gives you a car, you have to pay income taxes on the value of the car. But even though it's taxable, it still wouldn't be credible to CalSTRS. It has to be explicitly stated in the contract as salary. And the reason for that is that there are some things that, what we have found in looking at contracts, that things are paid to people that otherwise might not meet the definition of, for other reasons, of what would be credible compensation, but they say it's part of the salary. And so we want to make sure that is counted as credible compensation. Is trying to address a potential inconsistency between whether or not something was credible or not. So as long as it's explicitly stated as part of the salary, and it, then it would meet the definition of what's credible compensation. It has to be used as the basis of future salary increases. So one-time payments that are just sort of paid but don't go into the base would not be considered salary. They might be credible for other reasons, or it might be creditable, but gets credited to the DBS account. But it has to be the basis of a future pay increase. And then the final one is that it can't be. It must be paid without any requirement that the employer receive some proof of how the money was spent. So that's to basically make a distinction between salary and a reimbursement. So if they're paying you money and you don't have to show how it's proved, and it otherwise meets all the other conditions, then it would be salary. But if you're paying something for like reimbursement of a travel expense and you got to show receipts, then it's not considered salary. Remuneration in addition to salary, as I said before, may be things that don't meet these definitions of being the basis of a future salary increase or other things, but they still can be creditable if they meet certain, for one thing, if they're paid consistently across everybody in the class of employees, and then they're used to meet certain requirements that are actually specified in the regulations. For example, if you work 20 years, if you've been working for 20 years or worked for the district for 20 years and you'll get the stipend going forward, then that could be creditable. If you are employed in a position that's hazardous or difficult to staff, again, if it's paid on an ongoing basis, and it's paid consistently for everybody in the class of employees, then that would be creditable. If you have a master's stipend, that would be credible as remuneration in addition to salary. But it's not necessarily salary, because sometimes these kinds of things aren't the basis of future salary increases. They may not increase at the same rate that salary does. So that's what remuneration in addition to salary would mean, and that would be creditable to CalSTRS. Yeah.
So one of the things that you mentioned was a longevity bonus.
Mm-hmm.
But in the reg, it looks like under compensation is paid a limited number of times.
Right.
Says contributions for remuneration in addition to salary shall be credited to the member's DBS account
Right.
if both 1 and 2 are correct.
Right.
And under 2B2 is that longevity bonus. So I thought you said that went to the DB side, but this says it goes to the DBS.
No, it would go to the DB side if it's paid on a continuing basis. If it's paid on a one-time basis, then it would go to DBS.
So if it's a career or service longevity that only gets paid once.
Right, or
goes to
twice,
DBS.
or whatever. It's some limited number of times that the contract or whatever says you will get it X number of times, then it goes to DBS. If there's no end date to it,
It goes
then it can go to
to
DB.
the defined benefit.
What's credible compensation doesn't necessarily mean it's credible to DB. It means it's credible to the plan, which is both DB and DBS. Depending upon the nature of that compensation, it'll go to DB, or it could go to DBS depending upon how it's paid and how it's structured. So when I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so I just know that I think there's a lot of districts that pay a longevity bonus. It's not on the salary schedule, but it's ongoing for as long as you work for them.
Mm-hmm.
For that to go to the DB, then do they need to make a salary schedule that then includes those steps? Or if
No,
it's
just-
ongoing and it's in the contract is ongoing, it's fine to the DB?
I think as long as it's part of the salary schedule, I mean, as long as it's identified, it doesn't have to be in the step and column, it could be part of the salary
So it
schedule,
could be
just
an
like a master's
asterisk and a
stipend.
line on the bottom of it or
Just like the
something.
master stipend is.
Got
Yeah.
it, just like the masters, okay,
Right.
thank you.
So then in terms of compensation is not creditable, things, for example, that are not deducted from the member's salary, so it's paid by the employer, is not creditable. If it's a fringe benefit, which is not defined in the education code, but the regulations provide some of the qualities that constitute a fringe benefit. So for example, it's a good or a service for which the cost is paid by a third party or otherwise paid by the employer. It's compensation that's allocated to an employee to cover a personal or business expense that otherwise could be provided in the form of a good. So for example, an auto allowance is being paid in lieu of giving somebody an auto. That would be considered a fringe benefit. Or cash in lieu of a fringe benefit. So if you decide to not get health benefits and instead you're making the decision to take the cash, then that would be cash in lieu, and that would not be creditable. So those are the kinds of things that would not be creditable. So there's no contributions paid on it up front. It doesn't count towards anything. Expenses that are paid or reimbursed by an employer, for example, sort of the obvious things, travel, those kinds of things. If you have money left over from the payment of a benefit, then that also, for example, the employer pays, has money in there for a health allowance. If your health benefits aren't so expensive that there's money left over and they pay it to you in cash, that would not be creditable. So those kinds of things would not be creditable at all.
So before we go on.
Sure.
And maybe I'm jumping ahead. So an off-salary schedule negotiated one-time salary, I guess it would, payment, is credible,
If it's paid to everybody in the class.
as long as it's paid to everybody in the class. But the contributions then would go to DBS?
If it's something that we're saying we're giving everybody in the class of employees $1,000
Right.
one time, then yes, it would go to DBS.
So quite frequently, particularly in the times that we're in, we have employers that are unwilling to put those salary increases on a salary schedule, and they are giving one-time off-salary schedule increases in pay. Those would all go to DBS.
It sounds like it would, yeah. It certainly seems to have the qualities of that they would go to DBS, as long as they're not being used as a basis for a future salary increase and those kinds of things, which it sounds like it wouldn't be. It's a one-time thing that they've got.
And right now, those are credible to the DB?
No, they shouldn't be, because they're paid on a limited number of times.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
that's not
there's
any
no,
different.
there isn't really any difference in how they're
No.
being handled
The
now.
things that are really different between the way things work now and the way they would work under the regulations are things like how we treat like allowances under the credible compensation guide. As long as there wasn't any requirement that they be show the receipts, as long as it was payable to everybody in the class employees, then it was credible. But as we looked at it in more detail, we determined, quite honestly, first of all, a lot of them actually refer to it as a fringe benefit, so it was clearly not credible. And also, it was sort of like, well, you're paying this in lieu of reimbursing them for the travel expenses, so it's really an expense or it's a fringe benefit. So those kinds of things. But in terms of the off-salary schedule, offhand, I'm not aware of anything that's materially different about that in terms of how we deal with it now versus how we would deal with it under the regulations.
All right, thanks. Rich?
So I'm a little confused, Ed. Let's say you've got a class of teachers making $50,000 a year, and the district gives everybody in the class a one-time $5,000 bonus. What's your compensation at retirement?
If you gave everybody a $5,000 bonus, it would be,
One time. Next year
one
you go
time
back to
it would be
50.
$50,000, and then the
It'd be $50,000.
$5,000 would be credited to the DBS account.
To the DBS account. Doesn't count as, what if you retire that year?
It still goes to DBS.
Okay, so it doesn't, if it's just one time, even though it's everybody in the class.
Yes. The only thing having it paid to everybody in the class means it's creditable at all. If it wasn't paid to everybody in the class, it wouldn't be creditable at all to anything. But having it paid to everybody in the class means it's creditable, but because it's one time, it goes to DBS for everybody. And
Do we define the break between permanent and temporary? How many years?
yes, it in the regulations, it talks about how we would evaluate a limited time, a limited number of times.
And so there's a fixed number?
It's
If it goes 3 years, you're good, it goes into one place if you go.
No, it's defined as if you actually have an end date to it, or it actually specifies. It's not a question of it being one time. It's a limited number of times. If you specify the number of times they get paid, or over what period of time it gets paid, then it's limited. If it's not, if it's open-ended, then
Even though it could be for a substantial number of years.
it
So-
could be. I mean, it could be, but, you know,
Right.
presumably they're gonna do it, for the next 25 years, they're gonna do that. I'm not sure they would necessarily characterize it that way.
No, but I'm sort of thinking of during the conversations about this, there was a lot of conversation about extending the period of time on which your final compensation would be counted. So instead of it being the highest year, it would be the highest 2 years or highest 3 years. And if that's part of the conversation as to how you do these things, then if somebody's given an increase for 3 years, does it start to fall in the category of compensation that's, you know, it's the equivalent of counting your last 3 years worth of compensation and
Right, but, yeah, I mean, it's, as I said, if it was being paid for, if it said that for the next 3 years, they're gonna be paying you this amount of money for everybody, then it would go to DBS, even though it still fits within the final compensation period, because quite honestly, it's gonna be spiking those people's pensions, and
well, it's going to be increasing those people's pensions.
increasing their pensions.
Right, because
Well,
not
right.
not every increase in your pension is a spike.
No, well, and a spike is obviously a pejorative word. It wasn't
Right.
done deliberately to do that. It would
Right.
have that effect. So it would have an effect of enhancing their benefit in a manner that's not. And again, recognizing the underlying principle of the DB program is that the final compensation should reflect a consistent pattern of compensation for the person's career. To pay somebody or to pay a group of people something for 3 years and then take it away, I mean, it's you know, you're right. There's a certain point in time of how many years is it
Right.
become consistent?
Well, but we don't average your salary over your career and pay you your pension on that,
No.
which would be right? We
don't.
pay you your pension based on your highest salary.
Or not, your highest single or 3-year
Right.
salary. Right.
Right, so I mean, at some point, I think there is something, if something lasts long enough, it ought to be, I certainly think people think of it that way.
Yeah, no, they do, and and quite honestly, I mean, the kinds of things that we're seeing aren't things like, you know, we'll pay for the next 5 years or
Right.
3 years. We see it for like it's a year.
Right.
And even though they're actually doing the job, and again, there are reasons that we would look at for consistency, and this is the biggest issue that we are dealing with. In terms of, I mean, even though we've made great progress with the stakeholders, and I think they feel very good about the direction we're heading, and they know it has to be done, trying to measure consistency of compensation is the biggest obstacle that we've got. And we're continuing to work with the stakeholders and trying to do that in a way that is sensitive to the way 1,700 different school districts operate, but doing something that's workable for everybody. And it's not like they hate what we're doing, but we just need to work more closely on that. And that's part of it, is at what point in time is it consistent or is it not consistent? Okay? So which gets us to what we were just talking about, is trying to figure out what's consistent treatment. So the principles that the program operates under is there should be consistent treatment of compensation throughout a member's career among the entire class employees in such a manner that there isn't adverse selection, and that we exclude from compensation things that are done that were paid to enhance the member's benefits. And so we try to create some criteria around that in terms of looking at restructures that, you know, and so they identify some specific reasons that we would determine that an increase was still appropriate given these principles. That, for example, it's a restructure of compensation that meets the criteria of it being a permanent restructuring. Sometimes there have been situations in which administrators, particularly like superintendents, may have decided to not take the increase that other people got during a period of economic or budgetary constraints, and then they get a bigger increase down the road. That would look like, on the face of it, that, you know, somebody got a 10% increase after getting nothing for the last 3 years, and everybody else is getting 3% increases during that period of time. That would look like, on the surface, that it was being paid to enhance their benefits, but in fact, it was just a reflection of the fact that they deferred their salary because of a reduction in school funds. So those kinds of things, that kind of thing would be okay. We would see that, and then would say, okay, we understand why that's being done. If it's an increase that's consistent with Other employees paid to people performing a similar job duty with the same employer, that would be an indication that it was paid consistently. It's a change in duties, there's an increase in responsibilities, any number of things that we specify in the regulations as to why somebody might be getting paid a higher salary, that it's okay. As long as it's, as long as it meets other criteria, like if you restructured the job, that there's some, that restructuring sort of follows through past the career of that person, or whatever it is, so that we make sure that what we're doing is consistent with the principles that are underlying the DB program. In terms of appropriate crediting of contributions, again, if we determine that something wasn't paid consistent, it's creditable, but it may go to the DBS account, and then the regulations try to define how you divide up that compensation between what goes to DB and what goes to DBS, based on how long they've been in, how long that compensation was paid for that reason, what happened to their successor, how long they've been in that process, what other kinds of increases that other employees got, and this is the part of the regulation that we're still continuing to work on, that we're working closely with AXA, with CTA, with the small school districts, and others to try to make sure we have a good understanding of how that's paid. And then again, the compensation is paid for a limited number of times. We go into a little bit of time, like for example, compensation is for parity pay or lottery, we know are paid on an ongoing basis, even though it may only be paid once a year. So it would be creditable. It could still go to DB, and that wouldn't be a problem. We needed to specify that because for 2% of 60 members at least, it's okay to pay somebody once a year for something. That wouldn't be the case with the 2% of 62 people. That would not be credible. But for some cases, lottery payments or equity or parity pay is paid at the end of the year, but it's paid continuously each year. So that would still be okay. So that's sort of where we are as far as trying to define the terms under which things get reported to us for the 2% of 60 members. One of the things that we have to decide is, we have to get direction from the board on, is what we do between now and the effective date of those regulations. As I said, in the past, we had issued a credible compensation guide and had issued directives. There are some differences between that guidance and what is in these regulations, particularly as it applies to allowances, cash in lieu, amounts deducted from a member's compensation, those kinds of things. But the regulations are consistent with our recent interpretation. But what we suggest, just as we've talked about this more and more, what we would suggest is that the regulations only be applied for compensation that's reported for service performed after the effective date of the regulation. Now, what that means is, and I want to make it very clear, is that there are tools and there are still provisions of the law that are clear enough that we continue to do the work that the Compensation Review Unit does, that the Audits Unit does, to manage spiking, to prevent spiking, that are not inconsistent with the guidance that had been provided in the past and are not inconsistent with the direction we're going. So it's not that we won't be able to address spiking and these other issues until the regulations take effect, but just because there are some changes being made to how things are reported, we want to make sure that the employers have an opportunity to modify their contracts as necessary and not create confusion about what we do in the meantime. So what we are recommending is that we use this that in the interim that we would apply the credible compensation guide and the employer directives until such time as the regulations take effect. So in terms of the next step, if the board gives us the directions to move forward, we would submit the package to the Office of Administrative Law next week. They'd be published by the OAL. There'd be a 45-day comment period. That comment period ends February 3rd. There would be a public hearing on that in early February. You would, depending upon whether or not you need to make some additional changes to the regulations in response to the comments, there may or may not need to be an additional comment period. In the most expeditious manner, you would adopt the regulations in April. We'd submit the final package later on in a couple of days after that. It gets filed with the Secretary of State and it becomes effective July 1. If there are substantial changes made to the regulations in response to the comment period of the hearing, then we would need another 45-day comment period, in which case you would probably adopt the regulations later in the year, and they would take effect later in the year. But it's something that we feel can be done certainly within the next calendar year, that they could become effective. So in terms of the recommendation we're making, one is to direct us to move forward with the rulemaking process, to submit it to OAL, to start that comment period so we can get some more, have some more substantive discussions with the groups and something in writing that we can respond to. Second we do recommend that you delegate the hearing to Jack. You've done it both ways in the past. We don't obviously know what the hearing would be like, but our experience in doing hearings on campaign contributions, on P&I, on appeals is that we sometimes get people who come to the hearing, but generally not. We get the most substance out of the comments that are submitted in writing, but it's entirely up to you whether you want to. If you did not delegate it, we would probably have the hearing at your February meeting. If you did delegate it to Jack, we would do it at some appropriate time around the same time, but it wouldn't be as precise. And then the third is that we would recommend that you direct us that in the interim, we continue to use the compensation guide and the other directives related to it until such time as the regulations become effective. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Sure.
So Ed, I know like our district's going into contract negotiations this spring, and I was just kind of curious how, like I was looking under the section on release time on TRB 11 and 12, and you have kind of the bullet points on TRB 12 about how the employer deals with the reassigned or release time for faculty or teachers.
Right.
And I just, a lot of this stuff goes into our HR guides and our contract language, and I just wonder, how does CalSTRS, I know we do circulars that have, a range of efficacy in terms of communication with our districts. How do we go about communicating effectively with districts if there is some change that needs to be made in terms of language or how we categorize? We have, we obviously a lot of our faculty that do union work have reassigned time and things like that. So that has bearing moving forward. How do we do that well?
We'll do it in a variety of ways. One is that we have ongoing training that Member Account Services handles with the employers. So as the regulations are becoming effective, they can communicate what you need to do differently. We will do directives. We will do, we haven't really talked through the specific channels, but it wouldn't surprise me to do like FAQs on the employer website or even and also for the union so they understand what the rules are. And the regulations themselves will obviously be on the website. I mean, we hope that, the ideal is that the regulations are clear enough that it's evident what they need to do and they'll see it. It'll go out to everybody. It'll be widely disseminated during the comment period. So, and we've had, part of the discussion that we've had in developing these regulations is working closely with the employers so they see the actual language. So, there's a lot of opportunities for us to make sure that they do it right. And we want to, I think this, starting the rulemaking process now in December, even if it takes effect in July, gives a lot of opportunity for people to know what the rules are likely to be. And if you adopt the regulations in April, and there's still a few months to make some adjustments, they should probably start making their adjustments now if they can sort of see the handwriting on the wall, so to speak, in terms of negotiating future contracts. But we will do an extensive communication with the members and with the employers and with the stakeholder groups to make sure they understand that.
Can you explain or kind of expound a little bit more on the section around release time when you're talking about, so the options are to establish a separate class of employees, so a faculty or a teacher would be in a different class of employees if they had some kind of release time? Is that what that first bullet point means? Or could you just kind of synopsize what that?
Yeah, basically that if you've got, and again, the regulations aren't around release time per se, but it's an example of where it comes up. But if, for example, somebody is a teacher and they are given release time to be a department chair, their choices are either they can create a separate class of employees of teacher/department chair and report the entire earnable as a single, in a single line, or they could create them as separate assignments and they could report their teaching and what they do there and create an earnable and identify that that compensation. And then separately, what it is they're being paid to be a department chair. What we find, what they've been doing is, and what we found really wasn't, and what we determined really wasn't authorized under the law was just sort of saying, here's as a teacher, we have release time, we're going to pay you $1,000 to be a department head, but, they really should have reported that as a separate assignment, and they didn't do it the right way. So they're going to have to change the way they're doing it. And there's no question that they're going to have to change it, but that's how it would work. So if they were a teacher with release time, more than likely, the sense we got is that it was just report the teacher/department head as a separate class. I also want to point out that, apart from the other staff that have been involved in this, is apart from Ellen and Cassie, is Joyce and Martinez Wade from GAPA, but also Carolyn Kubish, who was working on these regulations before the responsibility was turned over to Ellen. So she worked on these for over a year. So a lot of what you see, and she continued to work on it with the other staff on this. So I did want to make sure that she was recognized for the work that she had done on this as well.